So, hi Laura, and thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me today about our co-edited book, which, as I mentioned beforehand, is coming out with OUP in May next month, and is called Song Beyond the Nation: Translation, Transnationalism, and Performance. It's a really nice opportunity for me to think back over the last couple of years working with you on our authors on this edited collection. And I wondered whether you could jog my memory and perhaps also for those who are watching us, tell us how this project emerged.
I think it grew out of work we'd done before, which quite often has always been around song, but also wanting to combine music and modern languages together and think about the different things, the disciplines we can learn from one another and how we can collaborate. And then from that, we ended up running this 3 day conference hosted at Wadham and bringing together music historians, musicologists, modern language scholars, literature scholars, and thinking about actually how we can talk to each other, because although it might seem there are lots of shared material there, actually thinking about the different ways in which we think of things, the different ways in which poets feature in the work that we do, or indeed the composers feature, musicians feature, meant that I think, if I remember that correctly, that there was a lot of interesting ideas about actually how we can create a sense of dialogue disciplinarily, but also then actually how that is inherent to the songs that we're looking at so much,
Yes,
because
I think
often we're working across languages.
yes, and that's an interesting notion that sometimes we think of interdisciplinarity as what one person does by trying to bring together several disciplines in their own work, but actually it can also happen in this collaborative way, can't it? Where you put together people from their different fields in a conference, in a dialogue, and then in a printed form, where they're both working perhaps within their traditional fields, but they are echoing each other, teasing out differences but similarities. But also, as I think we've tried to do in the book, encourage people to step outside of their comfort zones. So to ask literary historians to try being musicologists for a while, and to ask musicologists to become translation studies scholars. Was that something that you felt we achieved or encouraged at least?
I think it worked really nicely. And I think one of the ways that we did that was by giving people a task. So it wasn't just come and talk to us about how you feel about song or translation or any of those issues, but by picking 4 poets and saying, please talk about one of these figures. It actually meant that it encouraged people to think slightly outside of the box of what they usually did. And then again, to think, okay, if I am talking to people who study literature primarily, actually what kinds of things do I bring as a musicologist, and vice versa, what can I learn from them? So I think that idea of engagement and dialogue was crucial.
Yes, and I tried to think back as to how we chose our 4 poets. So the poets are Hafiz, 14th century Persian poet from Shiraz. We've got Heine, the German. Well, I want to call him a romantic, but that's probably a rather loaded term. We've got Verlaine, and we've got Whitman. So poets writing in Persian, as I said, in German, in French, and in English. And it's a while ago since the conference, which was 2 years ago in March 2019, when we could still travel and stand less than 2 meters apart from each other and have meals and go to the pub. So it's nice to think back at that. But do you remember how we settled on these 4 in particular? Because I agree that by giving people a poet, it helped bring what could be a very amorphous and wide-ranging set of questions into a degree of sharper focus.
Yeah, I mean, as I remember, we wanted a spread of languages and of periods, and then thinking actually about the kinds of figures that have been featured sufficiently in song to actually allow there to be a lot of material there from lots of different angles. And you know, some of them are quite. Heine is a very obvious person to look at if you're thinking about art song, but actually raises a lot of issues about identity.
Mm.
So I think those are the kinds of questions that we were looking at, and also an awareness that somebody, say like Whitman, um, is written about a great deal within literary spheres, has people who are interested in him from a musical perspective, but also is interesting because it's not just about an American tradition, but actually feeds into a lot of these ideas of transnationalism and how Whitman is influential in 1920s Germany or elsewhere. So those kinds of figures, and again with Hafez, thinking about actually how his poetry has been manipulated so much and transformed so much through the centuries and also across the world. So those were the kind of things I remember us talking about at the time.
Yes, likewise. And also, I think in the case of Verlaine, picking someone who might not have been quite so extensively studied, because if you're thinking of French 19th century poetry, which I do very much as an amateur, it's not my professional working language as French is not my working language as a modern linguist, but I'm interested in it. One thinks of Baudelaire as the person who crossed the borders most readily. He's hugely influential on English decadent poetry, on Swinburne. He's translated by Stefan George, I think, and then set by Alban Berg. So we think of Baudelaire as the very mobile person in French poetry. So it was kind of quite singular to take a step sideways and look at Verlaine, I suppose, who might have been less well studied in this transnational context. And as you say, Heine throws up these fascinating questions because a German language poet, but who was living in Paris for such a large amount of his life, and as a Jewish poet was very acutely aware of the tension between the nation and language and identities. And I think that gets brought out very much in your chapter, where you're thinking about translation not from language to language, but from century to century. So the way in which Heine, the early 19th century German poet, becomes rethought after the Second World War. So translation seems to work spatially, transnationally, but also temporally as a category across time. Does that seem a fair survey of what your investment in Heine was?
Yes, no, that certainly works for me. And actually, one of the things I was thrilled about with the conference was the historical range that we had. Because quite often when you're talking about song, you end up being stuck in 19th century or maybe looking at a decade from the 20th century. But actually the range that we have, chronologically speaking, I think is really stimulating and allows us to think about 19th century composers and poets, but also about 21st century musicians and poets. And I really like that thing of thinking about actually changes in translation practices as well. There's a lot going on, I think, in terms of actually how everybody selected the different topics of their chapters.
Yes, and actually that notion of the 21st century is important in the book as well, isn't it? Because we've got very contemporary songs by Sally Beamish, but setting our oldest poets, Hafez. So we've got a connection from 14th century Shiraz to 21st century Britain, showing that yes, mobility of poetry. And I suppose there's that cliche of poetry is what gets lost in translation, which I don't quite agree with. But I think the case studies here show precisely it's what's often captured in some quite significant ways. And I suppose also, if you think about that cliche of poetry being lost in translation, people have often thought that the quality of the poetry is what gets lost in song, isn't it? Is that there's again another cliche: second-rate, third-rate poetry makes the best leader. The best poetry is resistant to musical setting, and that story of Goethe being profoundly unhappy with Schubert's settings precisely because they seem to rival and compete with his literaries. And I think, from my point of view, the essays in the volume really upend that those two assumptions that poetry can't be translated, and that song can't translate literary languages. It might not do so in a literal way, but it's doing so in all kinds of other ways if we extend our understanding of what translation might mean.
Yes, and actually, if we think about these cross-disciplinary activities and collaborations, not in terms of subtracting, so taking away from the poem or somehow taking away from what music can do, but actually as supplements and complementary and as engagements, I suppose, would be another way of thinking about it. The other thing I found really interesting was, and this is sort of inevitable once you start talking about transnational relationships, is how much politics comes into the way that we're thinking about it. That's evident, I think, in part in your chapter talking about Russian song, and certainly in Jennifer Roniak's chapter talking about 1930s adaptations of Whitman. This idea that actually the culture around us, the society and the politics around us really do drastically change the way that we engage both with poetry and music and the kinds of works that get produced.
Yes, I think what I found interesting was the way in which empire emerged, almost by accident because of the topics that people proposed. So we called it Song Beyond the Nation. We were trying to get away from the notion that language is an organic expression of a nation, that song somehow musically expresses that belonging, and wanting to think precisely about the cross-border journeys of poetry. But our word nation perhaps um, didn't quite prepare me for the emphasis that we would have on empire. And you're right that in the Russian case, we're dealing in the 19th century with a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural space. It's very hard, in fact, to delineate what's ethnically Russian from the other forms of identity in that space. And then in the chapter by Emma Sutton on Whitman, moving from Scotland to the South Seas and to Hawaii and through Stevenson's poetry is an extraordinary mobility. And I suppose I'm interested in the ways in which song might be implicated in that poetics of nation, spreading European languages to the corners of the globe through the mechanisms of empire, and the way it might also resist that by giving voice to other cultures on an equal footing to the kind of European languages that we often think of as central to the song recipe, the song repertoire. And so I think that presence of empire emerged rather unexpectedly for me as a topic, and as you say, politics too, because I think I'm sometimes guilty myself of thinking of song as a private genre. Its origins in the 19th century in the salon, in domestic spaces, the intimacy of the poetry, the intensity of the personal emotions often make us think of it as a genre which retreats from the world. We leave all of that to symphonies and operas and big forms. And I think the way in which politics impinges, even in these intimate forms in poetry, is really striking, and perhaps for me an unexpected revelation of the interaction between the private and the public, of the intimate and the imperial in this context.
Yeah, and it's actually, I mean, I think thinking about it as a sort of testing ground for how individuals locate themselves in the political sphere and also socially. But one of the things I've always loved about working on song is exactly that mobility. It's the sense that, yes, in some ways it has got quite a strong idea of coding by class or by nation, but it can also somehow slip away from that and be put to use. And this, Gary Tomlinson has this phrase, song work, and actually what songs can do to create communities and also really detach them and allow for that kind of individualistic expression. One of the things that I think struck both of us looking through the chapters was how often the poems that people alighted on use the image of the bird, and the idea that you can kind of, they're not going to be bound by nations, they're going to go across these boundaries, but they also come to serve as a figure for what art can do, what the individual imagination can do, and I thought that was really beautiful.
And that's interesting because that's one of those transnational tropes which often link poetry. So in the case of, say, the Hafiz canon, you get lots of tropes which emerge from the particular context of 14th century Persian poetry, the rose, the garden, the beloved, the wine. And they can then translate and be repurposed in Romantic era Germany or early 20th century Russia. But I think we often think of them as culturally specific and tied to spaces, or the very Frenchness of Verlaine's diction tied to Montmartre or Paris. But at the same time, yes, those images have extraordinary valency and get detached, and the image of the bird seems an important one. And I suppose it makes me also think of Terence Caves afterwards, because we were very lucky to have Terence, who's a polymathic, wide-ranging, curious, generous thinker, who came not to give a paper, but came to listen and interrogate and create links for us, as well as doing it ourselves, I hope. He afterward picks up, I think, on that notion of bird song, and it reminds me of those ideas in Rousseau about language and music, and the way in which, I don't know, in evolutionary biology, we've often thought about song as something that's rooted not just in our kind of linguistic human identity, but actually in our embodied animalistic identity. It's just something we do, isn't it? We make noises, we ululate, we sing, we hum, and the extension of that into verbalization is a really interesting moments of, I suppose, loss of innocence, but also the attempt to make language feel, as you say, as mobile and as unbounded by class or gender or nation or empire or language as animal speech seems to perhaps be. But I'm no evolutionary biologist or cognitive literary scholar, so I'm straying into territory that's well beyond my competence in those thoughts. But Terence's afterward does, I think, some really powerful work around those questions.
Yeah. One thing I thought it would be worth bringing up again is issues of gender, because obviously we have 4 male poets, and this is something that I remember us talking about as well. We've got geographical range, we've got chronological range, actually thinking about the agents within the chapters and the role of performers, of composer performers, of actually how these songs travel, who is doing the taking of them to other places, and the kinds of networks that get built up around musicians and poets, which I think came out really nicely in a number of the chapters, from Benjamin Binder writing about Pauline Viardot in her spa town in Germany, and the kind of issues around somebody who has been a very famous performer as a singer, moving into a sphere where we think of her primarily as a composer and what that means in terms of her personal relationships. And then Carlo Caballero talking about American composers in Paris, and so on. And actually that kind of real sense of having people on the ground and making music and engaging with poetry was something that I thought came out quite strongly in a number of the chapters that we have in the book.
Yes, and it seems to happen quite organically. I think trying to work out why, possibly for 2 reasons. It's clear at the moment that literary scholars, musicologists are interested in widening the canon and in pushing the boundaries of what we study and including neglected voices, and that's been done in lots of ways. And it seems to be that in the last couple of years, particularly historical musicologists have been paying a lot of attention to the question of women as composers, as performers, as agents in this field. But also, as you say, just by looking at the historical record, even if you're not trying to do that consciously, it happens automatically because you just spot who is doing the work of, and here translation not in a linguistic sense, but in the kind of carrying from one place to another, carrying from the printed page into the salon space of performance and of recitation. And as soon as you look at that historical record, you see a far wider range of people involved. And I think also in the 19th century in particular, that brings in questions of class as well, because so many performers were looked down on as rather louche and not much better than all kinds of disreputable people in society. There's a kind of blurred boundary, isn't there, about propriety when it comes to particularly the female performer in the 19th century, who's a figure of allure but also danger, and certainly Viardot's story is very complex. I mean, emerging from a Spanish family, settling in Paris, making herself a doyenne of the Paris opera stage, but then settling in Baden-Baden, having a quasi non-affair with Turgenev, spending time in London. She's absolutely everywhere, and also always pursued by rumor because of the complications of the love life. But that's perhaps a traditional scurrilous story, and I think Benjamin Binder's story is a really powerful elevation of her creative agency. And it happens in lots of the chapters, isn't it, that women appear not as the poets, but sometimes as the translators, and very often the composers. And again, that wasn't. So we've got Jennifer Ronyak looking at 1930s Vienna, and we've got Sally Beamish emerging in Natasha Loges's chapter. So plenty of women composers emerging as the agents of translation from one language to another, but from the medium of poetry to the medium of performance and so on. Why do you think it is? Could we have found a woman poet who would have quite had the canonicity or just the presence or multiplicity of settings that Heine or Hafiz or Whitman or Verlaine seem to have?
It's interesting, isn't it, about the question of translation, who gets translated, and also who are the female poets who you would turn to within this time frame who, as you say, there's sort of enough traffic around to allow us to think about these networks in quite the same way, which is maybe not the reason to not do them, in the sense you could then reinstate. But actually, I think allowing for historical difference and thinking about women as agents here with lots of different roles to play, both from actually being subjects of the poetry, as in Peter Diane's chapter in part, but also then, as you say, as composers, as musicians, as people who actually share this material, and really importantly, as translators, as readers. I think that actually gives, in some ways, a sensitive and nuanced account of actually how women figure in here. I mean, if we had, I don't know, Emily Dickinson, somebody like that, would be fascinating to do, but maybe wouldn't have had quite the same tendrils put out, but maybe it would have done. I'm not sure. Maybe that can be a sequel.
Yes, Dickinson does make me think about that question, but whether her dominance as a female voice then makes the other female voices around her less visible because she overshadows them. So I think I absolutely agree that the agency of the translators, performers, readers too. I mean, historically, we've known that women have been very often the primary readers of literature over the ages, particularly in the 19th century context that we've looked at, and are therefore instrumental in selecting poetry, in shaping the canon by buying books, subscribing to journals, by copying lyrics out in their commonplace books, and so I think that hidden work emerges very strongly in the kind of more networked accounts that the book proposes. Because there have been lots of books about Goethe and the Lied, or Heine and the Lied, Baudelaire in song, but by taking out the name of any poet in the title, I think we clear the space for a far more sort of multifocal approach to what song work might be.
Yes, and I think that's something that you can see certainly within music history, but also in other disciplines. I'd be interested to know on your perspective on this, actually moving away from the single figure study generally and making it about that named person, be it Goethe or Beethoven or whoever, to actually think about how these artists work together and how their networks build up and how their reputations build. And I think that's something that's happening in music studies a lot, although not maybe as quickly or maybe as extensively as you would think, but it's something that's really certainly being questioned. And I think actually thinking about thematics here rather than necessarily individuals really helps to actually question those boundaries.
Yes, I suppose that's an interesting point to end up on, is where the states of our fields might be in this regard. And what I learned from collaborating with you in musicology is precisely this decentered approach to cultural production. A lot of modern language study is still quite author focused. Certainly here in Oxford, we teach great period papers with the canonical names in, and we teach special author papers. And we're trying to do the work of changing those, of creating a more diverse canon, partly because I think that's an important political gesture. We are the gatekeepers. What we teach is what our students learn. It's what they go on to read. We have a role in that, but I think we need to take very seriously. But also because there are such extraordinary voices out there who haven't always been heard, and it's simply satisfying to spend your time doing that. At the same time, I think sometimes we wonder where to look for some of those marginalized voices. What is it to not teach Tolstoy, but to teach Yevdokia Rostopchina, for instance, to name an important 19th century female poet? But when you do what you were just talking about, which is decentering it from the author figure altogether, and start to think of culture as readers, translators, publishers, composers, performers, you get this very lively, heterogeneous sense of what the world is. And that's always one of the biggest things I've taken from musicology, is that it isn't just, biographies and Tchaikovsky and Beethoven, which we've both written in our respective fields. It is also the history of divas, the history of the translators, the history of the salonière, who created the context in which song could flourish at important points, and who inspired poets not just as abstract muses, but as real people who had cultural power. And I think I'm really interested in thinking what the analogues in literary study are for us. How do we write histories of Russian literature which pay full attention to the female translators who have helped convey varieties of foreign literatures into Russian? How do I write histories of Russian drama which pay attention to actresses, female actors, and agents in the fields who were very instrumental in creating the preconditions for Chekhov's drama to emerge and what have you? So that decentering of the canon, not just by bringing new writers into it, but widening the very notion of who we might study, I think is something I've always really taken from the way musicologists have gone about what they do, which is not just the study of Goethe and Schubert, but is the study of the singers, and the very many other agents who are there in that lively field of performance.
Yes, but also nuancing that as well from the musicology perspective. I mean, yes, typically you'll have a musicologist who studies the music from a certain country and period. And actually the multilingual aspect of this project in particular, and opening up which languages people engage with, I think is really vital and is both refreshing and stimulating, but also proves that sense that actually without the command of languages, without being able to travel, then actually this history would be much less rich. And so bringing that to the fore and thinking about how we create these international cultural, political networks through a mixture of musical activity, but also translation and the learning of languages and sharing and communicating across borders, I think has been something that's really come out from me from this project and has been really invigorating.
Well, it sounds like this is not the end of this project, but that there could be a volume 2 to come, which looks at some of the questions that have just emerged now. But for the time being, we should probably draw our conversation to a conclusion and engage in some discussion with those who've been listening to us. But thank you so much, Laura, for your time today in recording this. And thank you for being such a wonderful collaborator and co-conspirator over the last few years in these various projects.
To you too. I hope we do much more.
Thanks, Laura.
Thanks. Bye.